Hello everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started now and talk about the environment and health. We're starting into part 3, the burden of disease. And we'll be looking at chapter 7, the environment and health. And again, my name is Dr. Sutherland, and I'll be going over this chapter with you and highlighting some of the important concepts and information that will be important to you as you study for your exam. As always, remember to read through and understand the learning objectives. Again, this will be important as you prepare for your examination. When we think about the environment and health, the most vulnerable people, that being the children, the elderly, and the poor, and then those with underlying health conditions, are often at increased risk for health effects when exposed to different environmental concerns. And so you'll be able to learn a little bit more about that as you read through this chapter. The text will, or during this chapter, you will begin to have a better understanding of how important the environment is to one's health. And we can see here some of the different figures related to the total burden of disease that is contributed by different environmental causes, and that differs based on the definition of environment that is used. And we can see it ranges anywhere from 8.4% of the total burden of disease all the way up to 25 to 33%, again depending on the definition. And the text is going to focus on just a few of these environmental conditions, because when we think about the environment, again, depending on the definition, it can encompass multiple aspects of exposure, ranging from, again, environmental hygiene, unsafe water, sanitation, moving on to air pollution, whether that be indoor or outdoor, and so on and so forth. We can see here that it's important for us to understand these links between the environment and the Millennium Development Goals. So read through Table 7. Because again, when we think about the Millennium Development Goals, we may not link that back to environmental health and exposures. But we can see that it does play an important role. So please familiarize yourself with this table. So this chapter, we're basically going, we'll be looking at unsafe water and sanitation and hygiene, and then outdoor and indoor pollution. So these are really what our chapter will focus on. There are a few key concepts that will be important for you to have an understanding, namely the word environment and what it entails. So make sure that you understand what that term encompasses. And we can see here, for the purposes of this chapter, that environment is defined as an external physical, chemical, and microbiological exposure and process that impinge upon individuals and groups and are beyond the immediate control of individuals. And so that's how they define environment. And then we can see over on the other side the concept of environmental health. And the World Health Organization has its own definition. And again, make sure you're familiar with that definition. And we can see that environmental health comprises those aspects of human health, including quality of life, that are determined, again, by the physical, chemical, biological, social, and psychosocial factors in the environment. And so we can see that when we think about environmental health, it's multifaceted. It's looking, again, not only at the physical environment, but exposures to chemicals, and also those interactions that we may have with our environment, whether that be those relationships and how they're formed through the culture that we're embedded in, and how that has an impact on our health. Table 7.2 is also an important table that, again, provides us with an understanding of these environmental health issues, their causes or determinants, and also their consequences. So make sure you read through that as you start to broaden your understanding of environmental health and its impact. So I'm going to focus the majority of the discussion today on key environmental health burdens, this section, and just go over provide some additional information about each of these sections. So we're going to start talking first about indoor air pollution. It's estimated that about half of the people in the world, or about 3 billion people, use inefficient stoves to cook their meals. And oftentimes they use these solid fuels for their cooking and also for their heating. And we can see that these include coal, cow dung, wood, logging waste, and crop wastes. And the problem with these is that they do not completely combust when burned. And so they leave behind these particulates, or these particles in the air, gas and chemical products that individuals then inhale, particularly in homes that are poorly ventilated. And we can see here that the amount of these substances in a poorly ventilated home can exceed World Health Organization norms by more than 20 times. So again, we're having a intense amount of exposure to these pollutants. Indoor air pollution is associated with multiple health issues such as pneumonia, low birth weight, cardiovascular disease, blindness, COPD, and so on and so forth. So we can see that it can have a huge impact on the health of individuals. So we know that these cook stoves are in particular are fueled by wood, coal, and again dung, and they cause approximately 1.9 million deaths each year. And again, when we think about those vulnerable populations, children are the most affected, and then oftentimes women, because by and large women are the ones that are doing the cooking. In addition to that, reliance on these biomass for cooking and heating also puts an increased pressure on our natural resources, and this then in turn contributes to climate change through emissions of different greenhouse gases. So it has some secondary consequences. And then lastly, women and girls often face personal security risks as they forage for these fuel near refugee camps or conflict zones. So again, we have some secondary risks associated with use of solid fuel for cooking and for heating. So we might ask ourselves, why haven't the impacts of these cook stoves and heating cook stoves and then stoves received more attention? And what we see is that the effects of exposure to these harmful cook stoves, to the smoke, have historically received limited funding and research attention when compared to other risk factors such as lack of clean water, sanitation, and hygiene, or diseases such as malaria that lead to similar levels of disease. And this is due to several reasons, but some of the main ones are that there's lack of awareness among both the affected populations and then also donor communities about the impact of harmful cook stove smoke and the corresponding benefits of clean cook stoves. So we see that public health education would be important in this area, again, to bring attention to this important issue. There's also, again, inadequate research into the health and also environmental impacts of inefficient cook stoves. So again, we could play a role in advocacy to try to bring greater attention to this. And if this is something that you're interested in, there's actually something called the Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves, and I encourage you to look at that. Next, we want to look at outdoor air pollution. In Table 3, we'll describe some of the common air pollutants and their health effects. A lot of us are familiar with ozone, smog, and carbon monoxide. So these are some things that we're probably familiar with. But we can see that there are many others, and these are just a few. It's estimated that the current average particulate air pollution levels in the developing world is approximately 12 times higher than those proposed by the WHO. So once again, we see that the developing world is oftentimes has a higher risk for some of these environmental health concerns than developed countries. Air pollution is a major environmental health issue, and it's vital that we increase efforts to reduce the health burden it creates. And the World Health Organization Director for Public Health and Environment has indicated that if we monitor and manage the environment properly, we can significantly reduce the number of people suffering from respiratory and heart disease and lung cancer. She goes on to say that across the world, city air is often thick with exhaust fumes, factory smoke or soot from coal-burning power plants, and in many countries there are no air quality regulations, and where they do exist, national standards and their enforcement vary markedly. So when we think about this whole aspect of globalization, we can once again see how the developing world may have greater risk for some of these factors related to industries moving into these regions, and again having poor air quality control regulations, and so they don't contain a lot of these chemicals from polluting the air, particularly when we think about these volatile organic compounds. Next, we want to move on to sanitation, water, and hygiene. This is a very important aspect of environmental health. It's estimated that 2.5 billion people lack proper sanitation. Also, 90% of the world's wastewater in the developing world is discharged untreated or partially treated. So again, 90% of the wastewater is getting back out into the system and then reconsumed by individuals, only partially or not treated at all. Again, the World Health Organization has cited that universal access to water and sanitation is the lifeblood of good health. It's also, when we think about access to water and sanitation, this is a key component of primary prevention to ensure better health among individuals. And again, oftentimes the world's poor and vulnerable are oftentimes more affected by this than others. And when we think about its impact, 88% of diarrheal deaths are due to unsafe water and inappropriate sanitation, as well as lack of hygiene. So again, if we can make an impact in providing individuals with access to clean water and proper sanitation, we can see a dramatic decrease in the death toll related to diarrheal diseases, particularly when we think about children. We can see here that the evidence states that improved disposal of human waste is associated with reductions in diarrheal diseases and other illnesses. Currently, more than 1 billion people, mostly again in the low and middle income countries, lack access to safe water sources within a reasonable distance of their home. I don't know about you, but I've been in other countries where I've saw individuals carry water on their head and where they've had to walk many miles just to have access to that water. And we can also see that 400 million children lack access to safe water. So again, that's important when we think about the fact that 88% of diarrheal diseases are related to unsafe water. Just some food for thought here when we think about some of the progress that we've made. In 2011, almost 2/3 of the world population relied on improved sanitation facilities. And so we've seen some improvements, and almost 1.9 billion people, this is since 1990, have gained access to improved sanitation facilities. So again, we're seeing some improvements, but despite this, by the end of 2011, again, it was estimated that 2.5 billion people lacked access to improved sanitation facility. When we think about these statistics, the world currently is not on track to meet the Millennium Development Goals sanitation target, which requires reducing the proportion of people without access from 51% to 25% by 2015. So we have a lot of work to do in this area. Some of the greatest progress that we've seen has been made in East Asia, and still we see disparities in regions such as sub-Saharan Africa. It's estimated that approximately 1.1 billion people still practice open defecation. And again, we know that puts us at risk for exposure to illnesses and diseases and parasites. The majority of those without sanitation, again, live in these rural areas, and 90% of all open defecation takes place in rural areas. So again, we see that some of these environmental exposures are heavily concentrated in rural communities. And so again, that's where health education can play such an important role. We have seen some decline in open defecation rates from 24% in 1990 to about 15% in 2011. So again, we're seeing some improvements there. Despite this, we're still seeing disparities in these rates, and only in sub-Saharan Africa is the number of people defecating in open still increasing. So again, this is where public health efforts are needed. As you continue reading, make sure you read through the section on the burden of environmentally related diseases. This will be important for you as you study this chapter. And again, we see when we think about the fact when using a narrow definition of environmental health or the environment, that only about 8.4% of the total disease burden in low and middle income countries is related to water, sanitation, and hygiene, and then pollution. And so that breaks down to the following. We can see that indoor smoke from household fuels comprises the largest percentage, followed by unsafe water, and then finally urban air pollution. And make sure you read through this section. Next, we want to look at the costs and consequences of key environmental health problems. We can see here that when we look at these three factors together, the burden disease from these causes is about 25% more than unsafe sex and about twice as much as tobacco use. And we know that tobacco use is growing, it's particularly in the developing world, in low and middle income countries. And so when we think about this, we can see that these environmental health exposures have a huge impact. Again, when we think about those that are at risk, falls disproportionately on those that are poorer. And we know that this has a negative impact on productivity. And then oftentimes women are the most affected. Again, because oftentimes they're exposed particularly to the indoor air pollution. In addition to women, we see that young children are also affected by all three forms of these environmental issues. And then the elderly are at particular risk for outdoor air pollution. Make sure you understand or read through this section here on reducing the burden of disease and how we've developed measures and indicators to try to understand, again, some of the causes of these environmental exposures and then what we can do to try to address them. And then I'm going to skip on over to page 155. And just conclude the chapter here with talking about future challenges. We've talked a little bit about the demographic shift. And we can see that one of the important challenges has to do again with this ideal of population growth. We're going to see an increasing number of individuals move into cities. And we know history tells us that oftentimes we see this urban sprawl, and then a lot of these cities don't have the infrastructure to provide, again, proper sanitation in particular, and then access to clean water, also freedom from indoor and outdoor air pollution. So the question that we have to ask ourselves is, how will these cities manage this population growth? Also reliance on industries that oftentimes are unregulated, and again expose individuals to highly concentrated levels of exposure to particulate matter, chemicals, and other things that they are breathing in. More than 2/3 of the global population, it's estimated, will live in cities by 2050. So again, 2/3 of individuals in the world will live in cities. Just, 30, 40 years down the road. This rapid rate of urban growth, again, will create enormous challenges on the cities and on the government officials, and also when we think about healthcare and the role of public health. Also, when we think about this growth, we have to consider the number of slum dwellers, and that's increasing. It's estimated that there's 800 million people, and again, this attests to the need for stronger governance in our cities to try to regulate, again, exposures to indoor and outdoor pollutants, as well as access to clean water and proper sanitation. So while cities, when we think about the benefits of living in a city, and they can concentrate opportunities for education, for jobs, and also services, but at the same token they can also concentrate health hazards as well as health risks. So individuals that are looking at how we can address this issue have developed some indicators that we can try to measure, again, the health and well-being of these cities, and they call this sustainable cities. So how can we make our cities sustainable? And so some of the core indicators include slum housing improvements that benefit health. So they're going to look at how can we make slums safe? How can we make these shanty homes safer? Also urban air quality, again in terms of particulate pollution, so they're going to look at this as a core indicator, and they'll use the World Health Organization's air quality guidelines as a benchmark. Healthy and efficient transport, that's going to be important, again, to reduce exposure to this outdoor air pollution. Providing sustainable modes of walking, cycling, and public transport will be extremely important, and then also looking at urban violence. When we think about cities as well, when we're thinking about environmental health, let's not forget that oftentimes we're seeing areas that are congested, and if we don't have this ideal of sustainable cities where we have safe and efficient modes for transport, we're going to see, again, dramatic increases in physical inactivity, and we know that it's responsible for 3.2 million deaths annually. Traffic injuries cause about 1.3 million deaths. Violence causes some 1.6 million deaths annually. And oftentimes this is linked back to alcohol. So again, these are some of these environmental health challenges that we face when we think of those psychosocial and social relationships that we have with one another. So when we think about developing sustainable cities, we need to think of concepts such as the built environment. This is important. Creating a green environment, again, where people have access to public green spaces for walking. A good social and economic environment, again, where there's street safety, access to jobs and schools. Food security and quality, again, access to healthy foods, clean water, and then health services. So these are some of the factors when we think about sustainable cities that will be important when we think about environmental health and its impact on individuals. Make sure as you finish up the chapter, you just read through the study questions and have a general understanding of these, because again, these will help you as you prepare for the exam.